Bom dia a todos. Vamos dar início, então, à nossa sessão de hoje do Café com Saúde. Eu queria, antes de mais nada, agradecer à Coordenadoria de Controle de Doenças, né, a equipe da Coordenadoria, a Cília, por ter dado essa oportunidade da gente estar apresentando aqui o nosso convidado, que veio para uma ocasião importante, que esse ano se completam 100 anos da gripe espanhola, tá? Uma doença que ceifou milhões de vidas no planeta e que é imunoprevenível. E, em cima desse mote, né, o Butantan e seus técnicos estão mobilizando uma série de eventos ao longo do ano de 2018 para tentar discutir, informar, educar, enfim, colocar na agenda das pessoas a questão da vacina e a importância da vacina enquanto um instrumento importante de saúde pública. Nós tivemos, no primeiro semestre deste ano, só para quem não está a par, um evento técnico-científico, um simpósio discutindo a vacina nos seus aspectos mais duros, ou seja, na questão mais tecnológica, a questão mais bioquímica, imunológica da questão e as dificuldades e as perspectivas para o desenvolvimento de novas vacinas. Nesse semestre, dia 13, agora, dessa semana, de setembro, nós vamos estar fazendo um segundo evento, que é discutindo os aspectos sociais e as questões envolvendo essa resistência da população, a questão da hesitação de utilizar a vacina enquanto uma ferramenta importante de prevenção de doenças. E, com isso, nós trouxemos várias pessoas, entre elas o nosso convidado de hoje, Dr. Brian Deer. Brian Deer é um jornalista investigativo inglês, tá, que já há anos vem trabalhando com a questão da saúde, com a saúde, os medicamentos, vacinas. Ele vem investigando problemas desta ordem. Entre eles, o que lhe chama a atenção foi uma investigação que ele realizou há alguns anos atrás sobre a vacina MMR e sua possível associação com o autismo, da qual se verificou que isso ainda não era um fato, e existia por trás disso toda uma problemática complexa. E que, dentro disso, ele teve várias outras atuações em cima da área de medicamentos, antibióticos, o caso do Vioxx também ele investigou. Então, ele tem uma bagagem muito grande e uma experiência muito grande nessa área, e a gente convidou para ele compartilhar isso um pouco com a gente hoje. Tá? Brian é graduado em filosofia, tem o título de doutor honoris causa em letras pela Universidade de York, e é isso. Eu gostaria que vocês aproveitassem a presença dele, tem tradução simultânea, e após a fala do Dr. Brian, nós abrimos para uma breve rodada de perguntas, e, após isso, nós teremos um branch oferecido pelos ECD. Então, passo agora a palavra para o Dr. Brian fazer sua apresentação. Muito obrigado.
Thank you. Good morning. I do apologize for my Portuguese, non-existent, I'm afraid. That's a failing of mine, but I appreciate you being here. I only had 1 hour's sleep last night, so if I appear slightly confused at times, that will be the explanation. But what I'm going to do is to give essentially a trial run. You're going to be my guinea pigs for the talk I'm going to give on Thursday. Assuming I can work out how to hold both of these at the same time and click the right thing, we'll go through those. You may find that, as with any new set of PowerPoints, some of them aren't finished. Perhaps 2 or 3 might be in the wrong order, but if so, don't worry. It'll all become clear, I think, in due course. Now, hopefully, when I press this here, Yes. So the question you might be asking is, why would you be here today listening to somebody speaking about vaccines from the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland? They're a little island off the European continent. Why listen to me? Why should I presume to come and tell you anything or discuss anything with you? Because obviously Brazil is a much bigger country. But I think we have certain experiences that perhaps are relevant. England, as I'm sure you know, is the home of football. We actually have won the World Cup 50 years ago when we beat Germany. We're the home of the Industrial Revolution. That piece of equipment there is called a spinning jenny. I think it might be an early version of the mobile phone or something. I don't quite know what you do. You wind it, I think. But this was one of the early inventions that made the Industrial Revolution, England the home to the Industrial Revolution. Of course, finally we are the home of the English language. So there's good reasons why I might be here today. We're number 6 in the world for arms exports. 5th in the world for pharmaceuticals, but, and this is the killer line, we are 1st in the world for vaccine scares. It's one of those things that England does very well. Scare number 1, the smallpox vaccine. I'm going to be talking a little bit about that. Scare number 2, a scare which erupted in the 1970s and 1980s over the DTP, as I think you call it, the DPT, the diphtheria, tetanus and pertussis vaccine, where there was concern that the pertussis, the whooping cough component, caused permanent brain damage in children, as it was called at the time. And of course, 3, the current scare, which is raging over the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. And then there's the question, are there forces at work now that may lead to a global scare over any vaccine at all, or all vaccines? And that's kind of the sketch of what I'm going to be talking about today. So, who and how? Scare number 1, the smallpox vaccine. Here, an Englishman invented the smallpox vaccine, William Jenner, at the end of the 18th century. And I believe, and somebody may correct me, that it was first used in Brazil in 1804. But that's my information. Somebody might say that, in fact, there's alternative information. I hear muttering in the audience that this may not be true, or this is at least controversial. In England, the experience with that was that after the discovery of the vaccine and the introduction of the vaccine, in 1853, a new law was passed, making it compulsory for the public to vaccinate their children. Nothing much came of that particular piece of legislation, but things started to happen more when a second law was brought in, which imposed fines and imprisonment for people who didn't vaccinate their children. And that created a tremendous amount of public controversy, and you might say a tremendous amount of opposition to vaccination, because it began to make vaccination a civil liberties or personal freedom issue, even way back there with smallpox. In 1854, there was the first book or pamphlet which came out campaigning against vaccination against smallpox, and it became a big controversy, not a fringe issue by any means at that time, which developed. But it was this man in particular who had a major role, William Tebb, and he founded an organisation which campaigned. He published a magazine. He refused to allow his daughter to be vaccinated, and on that basis was fined 13 times. And this man, William Tebb, turned up in New York at the founding of the first American campaign against smallpox vaccination. And there you see an Englishman's views on the subject. Oops. Well, let's go back. And he'd come to the United States specifically for that. And he argued, this is one of the things that he argued, the statistics showed, and I think statistics from that period, particularly when given by people who are campaigning against vaccination, but he argued that 25,000 children died every year as a result of being vaccinated with smallpox vaccine at that time. And 2 years later, he turned up in Germany, saying the same kind of things. But this really was the kind of beginning of organised campaigning against smallpox vaccination. And if my memory serves me right, it really became a major controversy in Brazil at the beginning of the 20th century, when there was considerable public opposition to compulsory vaccination against smallpox. Okay, so that's just a very brief sketch of the smallpox issue. Then we come to scare number 2 over DTP or DPT vaccine. Now this began really with a single paper, Kuhlenkampf, Schwartzman and Wilson. And yes, the Schwartzman in this is Jose Schwartzman, who I'm going to be talking to tomorrow, who was a very, very junior doctor, very young man at the Hospital for Sick Children in London, where he was working under a consultant, a man named John Wilson. And they published in a pediatrics journal in January 1974 a case series of well, it wasn't really a case series, it's more the data from a case series on children who'd been vaccinated. And what they did, it was interesting, they ultimately they found, they zeroed in on 36 children on whom they had adequate information. They only considered and took forward into their considerations only those who had neurological illnesses occurring up to 14 days after they received the DTP vaccine. 14 days, just 2 weeks. It's a very interesting time frame, and it's actually a time frame that became very important to me over the years in the work that I came to do on MMR. I did a long investigation on the DTP story, and I was working on it at the time the paper that was later published on the MMR that started the measles, mumps, rubella scare was published. The doctor that Jose Schwartzman was working under was a man named John Wilson. He was a pediatric neurologist, and he appeared within a couple of months of that paper's publication. He appeared on British television at a time when we only had 3 television networks. So the program reached, I don't know, probably maybe a quarter of the British population, reporting this apparent association between the DTP vaccine and what they then called permanent brain damage in children. This is before, really, at this time, this was before autism as a construct was fully developed, because as I'm sure as you know, autism is not really an illness or a disease or like that in itself, but it's a collection of symptoms and signs and behaviours which are kind of have evolved over time in their classification. Here was the TV show in April 1974 where Wilson appeared, and he was asked why he thought that the DTP vaccine caused brain damage in children. And he said, well, at this hospital I've seen a lot of children. And he'd become convinced that, that there was some kind of relationship. And then newspapers started to campaign. This is the newspaper that I've worked for the last 30 years, the Sunday Times, came up with a story. At the time, this was the beginning of mass newspaper campaigning. The United Kingdom is very big on national newspapers. And then, of course, the story then became about the public, the vaccine acceptance rates. Coverage dropped to about a third, from about I think 80% to about 30%. And that led inevitably to whooping cough outbreaks. And that's giving some figures there on how many were affected by that date, 1978. And then what happened, there was a huge national epidemiological study that was set up by the British government, funded by the British government, called the National Childhood Encephalopathy Study. And that sought to establish what was the risk from this vaccine. And they looked at hospitals all over the country and looked at children being admitted within certain age groups between 1976 and 1979. At that time, the vaccine was given to 2 million children, and they sought to identify those children who had developed neurological illnesses, were admitted to hospital within a week. Ultimately, they came to a calculation that 1 in 310,000 DTP shots led to brain damage. Now, this was the definitive study. It was taken up in the United States and all around the world because the British National Health Service, obviously not as big as your National Health Service, but it's a very developed system with, for the time, good data collection, and this was considered to be the definitive study and led to a global alarm over the DTP vaccine, well before many people here would have been born or aware of these kinds of issues. But then it came to trial in London, in a 63-day trial in front of a very senior judge to examine the cases. After the public scare and the epidemiology, he started to look at individual case records. The people claiming that the vaccine caused these injuries did not want these records to be examined. They said they were confidential. They said that the evidence was epidemiological, and epidemiology didn't include individual case studies. Nevertheless, the judge said, well, you're saying that this vaccine has this effect. Show us the cases in that piece of epidemiology, and I will look at the individual case records, case by case, child by child. He made these observations about parents' evidence, that he found that time and again, the evidence that was put forward by parents didn't marry up with the medical records. And this is something that is very, very common in these kind of vaccine cases. He looked at the 7 children that they'd used in this, sorry, I think my mic's gone off for some reason. Has it gone off? Yeah, it has. Oh, it's just, maybe I just need it back. Okay, so they looked at 7 children. They took, in this huge epidemiological study, 2 million vaccines. They ended up generating this epidemiology on the basis of just 7 cases. And he looked at these 7 cases, found that 1 had Reye's syndrome, which is, I think, often caused by aspirin. 3 had viral infections, which have been isolated. And 3 children weren't permanently brain damaged at all when they came to look at the records. So the relative risk collapsed to 0. Now, you'll remember that John Wilson had said that he got 36 brain-damaged children within 14 days of DTP. But under cross-examination in the court case, he admitted that in 8 cases there was no link. In 15 cases, he accepted there was another possible cause that he hadn't taken account of. And the judge only found at the end 3 for which at that time, and the science at that time, genetics and what have you, would be very rudimentary, if non-existent compared to today. He could only find 3 where they couldn't find another cause. In the original paper, which had started the whole thing in the first place, this paper from Great Ormond Street, published by John Wilson. Now, even so, the media took this one up in enormous numbers, enormous quantities of media output, because vaccine scares are great for selling newspapers. And this was the golden age of newspapers, long, long ago, when newspapers had massive circulations. And this particular journalist, 4 days after the judge had made his ruling that on the balance of probability, the DTP vaccine didn't cause permanent brain damage in children, and I think a lot of science has been done since which now confirms that, and the specific syndromes have been identified which people were linking to the vaccine. And this journalist said, everybody knows that there is a rare association between the whooping cough vaccine and severe brain damage. That's just 4 days after a judge said there wasn't such a link. Now, I particularly find this interesting because I asked myself the question, well, who was that journalist? It was me. I actually wrote this piece 4 days after the judge saying, well, this judge, he's only a High Court judge who'd spent 63 days examining all the experts and all the evidence, and I just 4 days later wrote this piece saying, well, everybody knows the judge is wrong. What would a judge know about something like this? Scare number 3. This is the one which I've spent, this will be on my gravestone probably, this particular story, on the measles, mumps and rubella vaccine. This was a scare begun by a man who worked at the Royal Free Medical School. And I'll say it now, although it's on a later slide a couple of times. 3.5 miles from where John Wilson started the DTP scare. So 3.5 miles north of where the previous one came from, to spread out around the world, we start with another one. This is a brief biography. He's since been fired from his job after refusing to validate his findings. The British doctors regulator found him dishonest and banned him from practicing medicine. And BMJ editors, the British Medical Journal editors, have dubbed his research an elaborate fraud. Here is his paper with the retracted stamp on it. I have to say this, not in order to brag or to make you feel that your money getting here today is well spent, but I did that. And I can genuinely say that many people have had papers in the Lancet. Many people have had papers in the Lancet. I've had one out, and this is the paper I had out. It was a case series of 12 children, and Wakefield said they had enterocolitis, which many of you will know is an inflammation of the large and small bowel. And they also had what he was calling autism, a behavioural issue, which I'm sure you don't need me to go into in any detail. 3.5 miles from where Wilson had started the previous scare in 1974. And there was a press conference held for this paper, and that was where concern over the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine began. And what he said was that this was his findings, that behavioural symptoms in these 12 children was associated by the parents with the measles, mumps and rubella vaccination in 8 of the 12 children, so 2 out of 3. So 2 out of 3, it's a case series. Parents of 12 children turn up at this hospital to a bowel clinic, paediatric bowel clinic, and 2 out of 3 of them say, it was the MMR doctor. I took my child to be vaccinated, and the first behavioural symptoms came on an average 6.3 days, but the range was 1 to 14 days. Now, if I've stressed things correctly in this presentation, you might notice the 14 days. And I was working on the DTP scare at the time on the day this paper was published. And a doctor actually pointed to the newspaper where it was on the front page, and he said, you should investigate this. And I said, no chance. I'm not investigating this because vaccines are an immensely multidisciplinary area of inquiries, I'm sure you realise. Very, very hard work to understand. Very easy to collect together opinions. This person says this and that person says that. Very difficult to understand it for yourself. 1 to 14 days. And I thought at the time, that's a bit odd. 14 days, a fortnight. It's for 2 different vaccines, 2 very different technologies. DTP, the pertussis component was considered to be the culprit. A formalin-killed bacterium, big, dirty bacterium, which unquestionably, in some children, did cause massive spikes in fever sometimes, and sometimes causing convulsions, seizures, on the first day in some cases. And then the other, measles, a virus, an RNA virus, in an attenuated vaccine. Attenuated live, they call it live, although viruses are obviously never live. Completely different technology, 14 days. That's a bit odd, isn't it? It's a bit, to me, I just thought that's a bit odd, and I said, I'm not getting involved in that. I'm not getting involved in that. I thought there's something funny going on there. So there's the comparison. I've actually got a slide for that comparison. You remember that Wilson said only those neurological illnesses occurring up to 14 days after DPT inoculation. You see, using you as my guinea pig, I now know I don't really need this second slide because I've already said it. And this set off this huge, huge scare in Britain. I mean, this is just a tiny, tiny fraction of kind of ways British newspapers covered it. And here was the result. You can see coverage at a very, very high level. Britain has no compulsory vaccination and has no plans to introduce it. And you see, obviously, this graph is truncated, but you see how the vaccine rate. That's 2-year-olds in England and Wales, those who have been vaccinated, and you see how that kind of coverage and that kind of scare took off in Britain. And then this came along. This was my first story. This was long after. This was in February 2004. So the paper was published in 1998, and I never got around to it till I started looking at the end of 2003. And what we found, this is the first thing. You don't have to read that letter. It's Wakefield was working for a lawyer. A lawyer had hired him at a very, very generous rate of pay. I'm not sure I can pronounce your currency. Is it the Real? Something like that, Real. Anyway, £1,421 per hour to create a case against the MMR vaccine. Now, nobody knew this, completely unreported. He never declared it. He'd been paid to essentially write that paper. And the lawyer involved, when I spoke to him, said that he'd paid for that paper in the Lancet. He paid for the research behind it. Here's the lawyer, we don't need to know his name, and he started to write to his clients. He was building a case, and he started writing to people, saying, if you have any children with bowel symptoms, contact me and we'll put you in touch with this doctor. And he told them that if they wanted to make a successful legal claim, they needed to say that the problem, the autism, as it had now become, began within a number of days of vaccination. And this information was going out 2 years before the paper was published. So these 12 families, well, actually it was 11, but 12 children, 2 of them were brothers, hadn't just turned up at this children's bowel clinic and the parents happened to just say, oh, doctor, my child was vaccinated and within, a couple of weeks he was showing the first signs of autism. They'd been brought to the hospital to make that allegation. They'd been collected together by the lawyers and by a campaign group and by Wakefield himself, been brought to the hospital to make the allegation, which was then anonymised in a case series of 12, published in the Lancet, and then created. The scare was the foundation of the scare, which then developed. One of the things I discovered early on, very early on, somebody very kindly gave me an earlier version of the same paper, because obviously, scientific medical papers may go through some kind of development. And this was an earlier version of the same paper that had been circulated within the hospital about 6 months in advance. And there was still the 14-day link. There was 9, now on this one, there was 9 children, 9 out of 12. The parents said that the autism came, first signs of autism were within 14 days of, were at the 14-day level. not 8. So the number had gone down over time. The number of parents making the allegation had gone down. But strangely, the 14 days survived. But it wasn't in the earlier version, it wasn't a 14-day maximum. The range wasn't 1 to 14. The maximum was the range was 1 to 56 days, and the 14 days was the mean. So in the evolution of the paper, sorry to be very complex, make this very complicated if you're not, hugely conversant with, although most of you will be, the scientific publishing. But so you'd still got the 14 days from John Wilson. That had survived, but it was now the mean, and it would be then, upon publication, would become the range. So this link was like tightened up between the versions of the paper, but still with 14 days. I don't know what measles virus understands by a fortnight. I mean, when you look, I've looked at the genome of measles, and I could, if you want, go and give you probably remember all the genes and what they do. I can't see anything there, that's complex enough for it to really fully comprehend the significance of a fortnight or 14 days. I don't know, maybe there's a church for viruses or something that they used to go to. So they essentially dropped the outlier, and the mean becomes the maximum. So he's then on the phone. Wakefield is then on the phone this is a slide out of sequence. Wakefield is on the phone as well, phoning potential candidates for his paper, and then phoning doctors to get the doctors to refer the particular patients that he wanted to see. So this is always a question I've raised, and I've been raising this one for years. I say these children were pre-arranged, pre-selected. If they were pre-selected, you might think there's a contradiction here, because I'm saying only 8 out of 12, 2 out of 3 said it's the MMR. So it seems to be a contradiction. They did all say it was the MMR. In fact, one didn't. They said, but only one of the parents, when one looks at the medical records, because in the medical board hearing for Wakefield's license, they pulled all the records, although I'd got this information beforehand. All but one of those families said it was the MMR, and that family changed their minds after the paper was published. So what was published, that was what was published, but that's what actually the picture was. So 11 of 12 of those families turned up and said it was the MMR. One family turned up and said it was a measles infection, although the record showed that the infection was rubella. But then when they came to publish it, they took 3 out because he was working for a lawyer, and the lawyer wanted to get a lawsuit going, and for a lawsuit you need a very specific collection of symptoms and signs to say, well, this is vaccine damage. How do you know a vaccine damaged child from another child who isn't vaccine damaged? So that's what they were trying to do. So the paper had been changed in that respect. Then we also found, this is a great, tremendous summary of what we got, that 3 of the 9 cases who were reported to have regressive autism, that's a sort of a subvariant of autism possibly, that where the child actually goes backwards. The child appears to be developing normally, and then they start to lose skills, or they appear to start losing skills. 5 of the 12 children had pre-existing developmental concerns. 9 of the 11 cases, 9 of cases out of 11 where they actually got to do the work. The histopathology was revised from normal to abnormal. So as they developed the paper, the pathology was changed. And there were cases reported as having onset of autism within days of MMR who were actually normal, found to be completely normal, many months afterwards. So pulling it all together, that is what the Lancet paper in summary reported. That's what Wakefield's paper reported in summary. So you've got, the first column is regressive autism. Did they have regressive autism? In the green, they reported yes. The yellow reported no. Non-specific colitis, they claimed, which is an expression you'd have a lot of difficulty finding in gastroenterology textbooks because it doesn't really exist. So most of all but one were reported to have non-specific colitis. Sorry, my lack of sleep is catching up with me. Within days of MMR, again, you have 4, 9, 10. What is it? Hang on, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 out of 10. Yeah, so that's right. So then you sit. So therefore, and at the end you say all those features together. That's what you get. In fact, what we discovered after we got access to the original children's medical records, initially through a court order against Wakefield, and then later in the British Medical Board hearings, we found that the true picture was that not a single child had the constellation of symptoms and signs reported by Wakefield. The syndrome he had been paid by a lawyer to create didn't exist, wasn't there even on his own data. So there's a selection of my stories in the Sunday Times, and then I did an hour-long television documentary for our Channel 4 network. There's me confronting Wakefield, the man himself, in Indianapolis. Approached him with the TV crew. He raised his hand, put his hand over the camera, yanked the camera down and took off through the Indianapolis Conference Center with me in pursuit saying, can you not stand your ground, doctor? Parents have serious questions to ask you, which he wasn't going to answer. And this was the effect of the investigation in Britain. This is the recovery of immunisation rates for measles, mumps, rubella. They ultimately recovered to completely normal. And the United Kingdom at the moment is entirely without public anxiety over the MMR vaccine as a result of newspaper editors and media editors realising that they'd been swindled, they'd been conned, they'd been made fools of. And then the British Medical Journal ran a series of mine in January 2011, big 3-part series, which you'll find online very easily, where they denounced Wakefield's work as an elaborate fraud. Now, why? Why would these people do these things? Well, William Tebb, in the first place, he was a campaigner. It's what he did. He was a very conscientious man. He campaigned against slavery in the United States, campaigned against war, campaigned against experiments on animals. He was very much against premature burial. That was a big fixation, I think, at the time in the late 19th century. He was against eating meat. He was a vegetarian. And he founded a charity for blind people. This was a good man. This was a person who was driven by the greatest ideals. He was an idealist. Here will be an incomplete slide on John Wilson. John Wilson, a paediatric neurologist. Now, it's difficult to imagine a more heart-wrenching, disturbing world for a consultant physician than to be a paediatric neurologist before the era of scanning. There's a little bit of CT scanning, tiny little bit going on in Wilson's time. But basically, day in and day out, he would see a procession of children brought to him who, as time went on over his life, over his career, he would kind of know, well, I saw a child like that who ended up like this a bit later, and then that and that. Because all, neurological injuries of various kinds, or neurological or behavioural issues, they're all different. And I think I think he genuinely believed, because the thing about the DTP scare that was different from MMR, in the time of the DTP scare, generally the medical professions believed it. There'd been case series going back to the 1930s where people were making these associations. Because the fever and the seizures that could be connected with vaccination was so obvious, people believed it. So Wilson wasn't going against the grain. He was going very much with the grain of medical opinion. Nevertheless, when I've looked at his paper and I've looked at other things that he has deposited in a library, he was very much involved with lawyers. He was involved in a smallpox case. A child was allegedly, and probably was, I don't know, who can say, looking back, but certainly he was hired to represent the interests of a child injured by a smallpox vaccine, which I think back in the day did have quite a significant side effect rate. And there are things about that paper which make you think he wasn't entirely working to the agenda of a paediatric neurologist. For example, he talked about vaccine batches, whether particular batches of vaccine were potentially at fault. And that's not a neurologist's observation. That's a product liability lawyer's observation. And it's very odd to find it. I find that very odd to find that in the paper. He's a very old man now, so it's kind of difficult to go after him. And I don't really have the time I go back into DTP. But when I finish this slide, I will try and raise the position of someone who was a neurologist, a grand profession in medicine, very grand people, who did a lot of guessing because they didn't have the technology. And even today, genetics, where was genetics in the early 1970s, So it was quite a pessimistic profession. But I've heard only good things about him. In fact, I know somebody who was a junior doctor under Wilson who said how they'd gone with him to break the news to the parents of a young boy who had been diagnosed with subacute sclerosing panencephalitis, or SES-SP, as it's usually called. And if you don't know, it's an absolutely appalling, almost invariably, probably always fatal illness that can take years to kill. Begins with seizures and lack of responsiveness, and eventually child can't walk, and it's essentially just utter destruction. And I heard how Wilson had explained very carefully and very sensitively to the parents what the future had in store for them. And of course, SSPE is caused by measles virus. And then there's Wakefield. Man, utterly corrupt, complete moral blindness. He had a big idea. He had this idea that measles virus caused inflammatory bowel disease, specifically Crohn's disease. And this was his idea, and he was going to prove it. And initially he got involved in autism because the lawyer couldn't find anybody else in the United Kingdom to make a case for him. So I better move on. So what in all this? The so what is obviously measles outbreaks, which are now occurring, which you know all about. It's happening all over the world. There's just 3 examples from the last few months in the media. This is a subject that really interests me, and I'd really like to talk to people about this. Global eradication, the campaign which has been set back. This is a stamp for Rinderpest. And the interesting thing about Rinderpest, 2 interesting things about Rinderpest. One is that Rinderpest is considered to be the precursor RNA virus to measles, that human measles developed out of Rinderpest in cattle. That's the first interesting thing, I think, for me. Second interesting thing for me is that Rinderpest has been eradicated. Along with smallpox in humans, Rinderpest in cattle and some other animals has been entirely eradicated from the planet, according to the WHO. The scare over vaccines, and particularly the MMR vaccine, is delaying the potential elimination. Some governments, as you know, are now introducing compulsion, what was introduced in the 19th century in smallpox, We're seeing, particularly in California, Italy, Australia, but also lots of other places, this issue is being considered. And the question for me is, are we now seeing the beginning of yet another scare, but a scare over essentially any vaccine, or all vaccines, growing out of the measles, mumps, rubella thing? Here is Wakefield now campaigning in the United States, where he claims a US agency and not him is responsible for fraud, accusing the Centers of Disease Control. I'll probably skip through these. This is, because the time is probably getting short, I should just very quickly go through these. This is Wakefield talking on Facebook, claiming that he's discovered a fraud allegedly this man has confessed to fraud, although this man Wakefield claims that this is a whistleblower who's blowing the whistle on the US Centers of Disease Control as being involved in fraud, whereas he says that he wants to be absolutely clear that he believes that vaccines have saved and continue to save countless lives. This is I think I probably ought to stop. I think I'm going to stop now. Let me just, because I'll keep this for Thursday, because otherwise you'll get exhausted. So what I want to say is, people often talk about vaccine scares as though they've sort of somehow come out of the blue. The big sociological forces are at work, and I'm sure that's true. I'm sure big sociological forces are at work. Nevertheless, my case would be that it's real people and specific facts. And that's what I've tried to contribute to the vaccine issue, because I'm not a doctor. I don't give my own opinions on the things. I don't tell people whether to vaccinate their children or not, or whether vaccines do or don't cause this condition or that condition. None of that is my business. My business is to try and help people understand where these ideas came from, who was behind it, what did they do, and therefore, to what extent do we feel we want to rely on their testimony? Because all that anti-vaccine campaigners need to accomplish, which is what Wakefield realised very early on, you only need to establish that there's a debate. These people say this, those people say that. Who do you believe? Who knows? We're not experts. And that's all they need to do, is to split the difference. But when you look at their side of the anti-vaccine side of the case, how the anxieties were built up historically by particular individuals in particular contexts, I think it helps parents or people who come to know of these things, helps them to get a better understanding of where these things came from, and therefore perhaps how to address them when dealing with the public. Because the bit that I'm cutting out there, because it's taking too long, is to say, yes, there are these issues about measles outbreaks and coverage and those kind of things. But to me, the emotional core of it and the unaddressed issue, the real vaccine victims, if you like, are those parents who believe, and it's particularly mothers. It's found that among anti-vaccine groups, Australian research has showed that in anti-vaccine groups, 3 out of 4 of the campaigners are women. It's a very female coloured thing, and you can kind of see why that might be. These are women who've been led to believe that it's their own fault, that they are to blame for their child's autism, in this case, because they took their child to be vaccinated. If you're a real scholar of autism, there was a theory back in the 50s and 60s called the refrigerator mother theory. The autism was caused by mothers being cold, unaffectionate mothers led to autism. It's called the refrigerator mother idea. And this, in a funny way, plays on the same idea, that it's the mother's fault. I took my child to be vaccinated. I didn't listen. As the years go by, this strengthens. I didn't listen to Dr. Wakefield. I took my child to be vaccinated. Now they've got autism. And I think that particular group of people, that's the breeding ground for anti-vaccine militancy, where people get on the internet and they join campaign groups and they create anxiety. And I think it's that particular group of people who, for me, are the ones that I regard to be the vaccine victims that are best addressed by the kind of journalism that I've tried to do. So thank you very much. Sorry to skip slides, but I should think you're tired of listening to me by now, especially in English. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Brian. Agora, nós abriríamos aí alguns minutos para a gente fazer alguma discussão, tirar algumas dúvidas e perguntas ao Brian. Alguém se habilita? Um momento. Falar sempre no microfone para a questão da tradução.
Okay. Good morning, Dr. Brian, but I will speak in Portuguese, okay? Because I don't speak English well. But I need to expose for you some situations in our state. My name is Helena, coordeno o programa de vacinas aqui no estado de São Paulo. Nós somos uma grande equipe. As pessoas que estão aqui, temos pessoas que trabalham diretamente com imunização e outras várias que, direta ou indiretamente, trabalham na área de imunização. Foi extremamente muito oportuno e muito claro a sua exposição. Nós já tivemos, sim, notícias, o grande estrago que foi essa publicação desse artigo, né, por essa pessoa em relação à relação de autismo e vacina do sarampo. Sabemos o estrago que isso ainda traz. Eu queria trazer a experiência nossa com a vacina HPV. A vacina HPV entrou no Brasil no ano de 2014. Na primeira semana que iniciamos a vacina contra o vírus HPV, 10 meninas, num município muito perto daqui, chamado Bertioga, 10 meninas, parte delas tiveram dor de cabeça, né? Algumas desmaiavam, mas 3 referiam paralisia. 3 paralisia. Estas meninas, né, essas crianças, essas adolescentes, quer com paralisia ou com dor de cabeça, né, ou com desmaio, foram avaliadas no hospital de referência, naquela região. Ficaram em observação por umas 3, 4 horas no hospital e todas ficaram bem, incluindo as 3 que falavam em paralisia. Foram para casa. No dia seguinte, voltaram para a escola. E as mesmas 3 meninas que falavam em paralisia, na escola, voltaram a ter de novo. Aí, de novo, essas 3 foram para o hospital, foram avaliadas pela equipe médica e melhoravam no dia seguinte. Voltaram para casa. Uma terceira ida, de novo para a escola, as mesmas 3 meninas, novamente paralisia. Com essa situação, essas meninas foram internadas no hospital da região e, resumindo, foram feitos exames, uma delas até chegou a fazer líquor pelo comprometimento neurológico, algumas fizeram tomo, mas, resumindo, todas não tiveram nenhuma alteração anatômica. Nenhuma delas tinha nenhuma alteração. No decorrer das nossas ações, nós tivemos mais 5 meninas no estado de São Paulo como um todo. Tivemos uma paciente que falava que não conseguia mexer as pernas e chegou a fazer eletroneuromiografia, que é um exame bastante específico e bastante doloroso, mas ela ela falava que não conseguia andar e o exame mostrava que ela não tinha situação nenhuma para não andar. Resumindo, nós montamos aqui no estado de São Paulo uma grande equipe de pediatras, psiquiatra, a gente tinha uma ajuda de uma psiquiatra infantil, neurologistas, montamos uma rede aqui no estado de São Paulo com hospitais de referência e não tivemos mais nenhum caso. A conclusão que chegamos, e isso já tem descrito na literatura, que é a chamada reação de ansiedade pós-vacina, né? Então, eu só quis trazer este exemplo no sentido de corroborar, né, mais uma vez, parabenizar o seu trabalho, né, tudo isso que foi feito, mas a gente também, isso não foi só São Paulo, temos em outros estados também, que esse tipo de situação ocorreu. Daí a importância, né, da investigação detalhada, de uma investigação sistemática e uma investigação em conjunto. Ou seja, no Brasil, nós temos o Ministério da Saúde, tem um Sistema Nacional de Investigação e de Notificação dos Eventos Adversos. Então, essa notificação e essa informação, não só do município indo para o Estado e do Estado informando o nível nacional, é muito importante para que a gente, em conjunto, possa avaliar esses eventos. Então, era isso só que eu queria comentar.
Obrigado, Helena. Dr. Brian, quer fazer um comentário? Do you want to speak something? Mais alguém se habilita? Alguma questão?
Então, meu nome é Valdeli Dias, é do Instituto Butantan, pesquisadora científica, e eu acho que a gente está lutando com armas que não são exatamente equivalentes. A internet é uma arma extremamente difusora de ideias, para o bem ou para o mal. E a gente, será que nós estamos, como cientistas, como jornalistas, capacitados para essa guerra? Porque nós temos, por exemplo, aqui no Brasil, onde a gente tinha, até o ano, 2, 3 anos atrás, 95% de cobertura vacinal, por exemplo, na poliomielite, nós temos, neste ano, 56%. A vacina tríplice, nós temos 70%. Então, como é que nós vamos fazer? Quer dizer, qual é a sua ideia, assim, mundialmente falando, que a gente precisa atacar e informar as pessoas que elas estão tendo, que elas estão sendo, de certa forma, levadas a uma situação de fato, acreditar que os micro-organismos sumiram, quando, na verdade, nós estamos todos vacinados. Eles não sumiram, eles continuam aqui. É que toda a população que existe na face da Terra está vacinada. Então, quer dizer, daqui a 5 anos, se ninguém mais se vacinar, nós todos morreremos de doenças que foram quase erradicadas. Então, quer dizer, qual seria, na sua opinião, a atitude a nível mundial para que a gente tomasse uma força e conseguisse informar as pessoas?
Okay, I think a lot has to do with making information available from credible sources. And one of the things that has become problematic, particularly in the United States, which sets trends and creates public attitudes that often spread around the world, is ensuring that information is not only available, but is available from people who are not only independent, but are seen to be independent. And, for example, in the United States, I do think there's an issue, and I've even spoken to people at CDC and former people at the CDC in Atlanta who really think that being a vaccine promoter, an advocate for vaccines, which it is par excellence, can create a conflict with its role as a vaccine watchdog, because it's also the source of a great deal of research, and that perhaps the investigative function, the research function, should go off to a different entity. If only because when you have one entity responsible for promoting vaccines and also for assessing their safety, you have budgetary competition. You know, the more you spend on one, the less you spend on the other. And so there are those kind of issues. So I think that's one aspect. I also think something that was tried in Britain that was quite successful was to set up a website that was funded by the government that had lots and lots of information. So that instinct that people have, you know, the instinct you have to Google your own symptoms or to regard Google as an oracle that can answer any question in your life, where you can find a website that takes that instinct and allows people to feel that they're researching. Britain had such a website, but it was eventually taken down for budgetary reasons. The government was cutting the number of government websites. So I think that's a route. But I also think one needs to address and better understand that phenomenon of the mother warrior, the campaigner who believes that their own child has been injured by vaccines and becomes a crusader and puts up money and runs websites and holds protests and things like that, and find some way to address their situation, to try and see the world through their eyes. Because I don't believe they're impervious to reason. I believe that there's a gap in their knowledge that allows them to come to these kind of conclusions for all kinds of personal and emotional sort of reasons. And it's interesting talking about cases that are then the individual cases that are looked into when you finally, usually in a court case, you actually get the medical records of the alleged vaccine injured child, and you look at them and see what's in the records. I've found that, and I can't say it's a scientific survey, but I'm talking about a few dozen cases of my own now, which I'm aware of, and I've found for one reason or another. You often find, it's an interesting phenomenon, you often find it's the most militant campaigners, the most angry, the most sure, not just that scientists and government are wrong, but they know they're wrong and they are lying, and you get a lot of that now, and this kind of poisonous idea that people working in regulatory agencies and involved in research know that vaccines cause these injuries and are covering them up. And that's a very, very common thing. It's the people who have those kind of ideas, the really bitter, poisonous ideas about the human condition, whose cases, when you look at the actual medical records of their child's cases, are usually the weakest. And we even had a case in England about, I don't know, it must have been about 3 years ago, where there was a case came to court. It was a family matter, law matter, where the mother had simply fabricated a complete narrative about how she took her child to be vaccinated. Her child then suffered from fits, was in a persistent vegetative state, she said, and all that kind of stuff. And the judge said, this is a complete fabrication. And she was one of those absolute most militant campaigning mothers. And I find that a very interesting phenomenon. I mean, I'm not trying to pick on them in any way, but I think understanding that kind of what makes an anti-vaccine campaigner very interesting. And I have to say, looking at it as a journalist, I find a lot of the scientific attempts to look into that have been pretty pathetic. I mean, there are sociologists who do academic papers and get them published and probably get grants for, well, they will get grants for them. And they say, well, when we get a focus group of parents together and we show them these kind of cards, giving them these kind of messages, and then we have another focus group of parents and we show them give them these cards and these kind of messages, every message we give makes them more anti-vaccine, and we can't understand why that is. And you just think, well, you know, I don't actually think that's a very productive way of approaching it. But sort of academic sort of sociology and things has proved itself, I think, completely hopeless at this. I do think you have to see the individual cases and tell the individual stories. The way I showed a couple of slides, I think, perhaps only one because one's missing. One of the things that made the vaccine story so good for newspapers, and I think even when we don't have newspapers so much now, we have like the internet, was the photograph of the mother and child. It was a great one. You had the mother and her injured child, and it was kind of like, it was almost a religious kind of icon. And I think that public health messages need to kind of unravel that a little bit and perhaps show a few cases of these mothers and perhaps fathers and their children where the story just isn't true. So people might associate this image with a more complex understanding of the human condition. But I suppose the good news, in a funny way, is that newspapers found vaccine scares a very cheap story. You don't need to do a great deal of research as a reporter to do a vaccine scare story. Similarly, you don't need to do a great deal of research to do an infectious disease outbreak. So just as vaccines injuring children is a great story for a journalist, very exciting story, you know, it's human interest, public interest, great story. So when you get infectious disease outbreaks, so you may find that there's a kind of a corrective mechanism that, yeah, we'll see outbreaks of disease, but then if we have media, whatever the media is at that stage, we'll correct it. One of the differences, of course, is that with the DTP scare, big media said there's this terrible vaccine that's injuring children, picture of mother and child, sympathy, concern, all that kind of stuff. Then, particularly after the court case, the media said, oh, no, the vaccine doesn't cause brain damage. Look, it's caused all these infectious disease outbreaks. We've got children dying of whooping cough. Another great story. So you have, and then big media said, right, that's the case over. And the DTP scare disappeared, such that most British adults would never have heard of it, would never have known that it ever happened, because big media just said, no, gone, move on to something else. You can't do that now because the internet is not controlled by journalists or editors or any kind of sort of other dynamic. It's controlled by these people who have these views, who can communicate directly to each other in a marketplace of ideas. You know, you Google something and what comes up is not necessarily true. So it's a very complex situation, and I think, but at the heart of it, I do believe are these parents who have these beliefs. So sorry to take so long.
Bom, mais alguém quer fazer alguma colocação? Enquanto isso, eu vou fazer uma pergunta para o Dr. Brian, ou para o Brian. A questão é a seguinte. Durante esses processos de investigação que foram realizados, que não foram poucos, envolvendo não só vacinas, como também medicamentos, que eu pude ler na biografia do Brian, como você vê o comportamento das associações científicas, né, e do governo? No caso aí da Inglaterra, que tem um sistema de saúde bastante robusto e com uma excelente reputação. Dentro desse processo de investigação, como é que se postam essas instituições, governo e associações científicas?
Position in what respect?
Como?
In what do you mean the position of them? I mean, I don't.
Yes. Minha pergunta é assim, durante as investigações que você ou sua equipe realiza em cima de um determinado tema, vacina ou medicamento, as associações científicas envolvidas, pediatria, imunologia, etc., e o sistema de saúde inglês, que é bastante reputado, a relação de vocês com essas instâncias é uma coisa tranquila? Eles têm uma colaboração, um aporte de de informações ou tem certo antagonismo nesse processo?
No, I've received almost no help at all from them. By and large, the medical establishment tried to prevent me from carrying out my inquiries. The thing about the Wakefield story, another important thing apart from these parents, to me, is that if he could fake a paper in the Lancet and accomplish what he did on such a high-profile subject, I ask myself, who else is doing what? How much science can we trust? And the medical establishment never wanted the Wakefield story to be investigated. Some of them, even today, and in America, people who are like pharmaceutical industry spokespeople, they're physicians with big reputations, but nevertheless they're spokespeople for the industry line. Don't like me at all, and believe that I shouldn't have done this. And what do I know? How could a journalist get to the truth on these things and have such an effect when they couldn't? I mean, if I'm quite cynical about it, I mean, vaccine scares are good business for some people in medicine as well. But no, the most help I've been able to get is sometimes on very technical matters. I've been able to go to people who would be, kind of very solid establishment type people like molecular biologists and things like that to explain some particular technical aspect. But I've not had any particular collaboration, and I've not really wanted it.
Obrigado. Mais alguém?
Brian Cília, jornalista. Duas questões. Eu entendo que, às vezes, as fontes elas são ligadas a instituições sérias e, ao mesmo tempo, elas fazem colocações que são discordantes entre elas. Isso dificulta o trabalho do jornalista. Isso é um fato aqui em São Paulo. E uma outra questão, uma revista como a Lancet, que é conceituada, o processo de análise do artigo antes da publicação passa por pareceristas conceituados, também rigorosos. Esses pareceristas não pegaram essas questões desse desvio do artigo?
Okay, well, with the Wakefield Lancet paper, it went through peer review, as it's called, and the peer reviewer who we found, who'd endorsed it and recommended it to be published, was a pediatric gastroenterologist. And he had studied as a student under the senior author. Wakefield was the first author of the paper, and another man was the senior author, the last author, a man named John Walker Smith, who was an Australian, in fact. And the peer reviewer said that anything from Professor Walker Smith, he knew, the peer reviewer knew would be a good paper. So it's what we used to call the old boys network, the sort of club of that particular area of medicine that allowed it. Because, I mean, the thing is, people, as you say, think that a journal like the Lancet or the New England Journal of Medicine, which I think everyone would accept is the sort of #1 general medical journal, you assume that there is some kind of special mystique about them or some special expertise. But when it comes to it, you can only really, this was an anonymized case series. It would never have been, it cost, I would guess, at least $1.5 million US dollars per child has been consumed in the investigation in terms of disciplinary hearings, court cases, and all the rest of it. That was just to crack a series of 12 children, very small study. What the resources it would take to go behind, because what I was able to do, and I think it's my signature life accomplishment, if you like, was to go behind the face of the paper. Because otherwise, if you're a peer reviewer, you're just sitting there with a text in front of you, and and it says that there were, if you're doing my first ever real investigation was a story of a man, British guy in Australia, who fabricated his research on the safety of the oral contraceptive, new generation of oral contraceptive. And what he did, he took data from about sort of 6 women and changed the 6 to 60, or he got 10 women and changed it to 100. And he claimed to do research on beagle dogs, and there weren't any. And they made it all up. And the thing is, who's ever going to detect that with anonymous, if providing it's done in a particularly, a reasonably skilled way? Experts, they're just looking at the face of the paper. And I sometimes joke, that sort of peer reviewers, they kind of hold it up to the light, or they smell it, and they say, oh yes, I like those p-values. The control group is excellent. I mean, how on earth can you really judge these things? At the end of the day, the Lancet in particular, which was launched in the 1840s, the time of the smallpox, hence the Lancet, hence its name, the early age of smallpox vaccination, is really a tabloid magazine. It's just another kind of magazine trying to sell itself. And it's the general medical journals, more than any other, who have to build a readership across medicine. So you're trying to get people who are family doctors, neurologists, pediatricians, gastroenterologists, and every last kind of ologist to read your journal. So the Lancet in particular has a tradition of publishing things that are sensational, because that's how you build a circulation. So journalists, and I'm as guilty as this as anybody, journalists have a tendency, because scientific journals are not in competition with mainstream media by and large, to promote things that are published in learned journals, which are really just anything else. If an aircraft over Sao Paulo today crashed into the middle of the city, there'd be all kinds of media coverage, and all the media would be onto it. But they'd all be in competition with each other. They'd all be able to check the same facts and interview the same people, get the same photographs, look at it from the same angle, find the same experts. And so you've got this cross-checking of validity in mainstream media. You don't get it in scientific publishing. And in fact, medical journals often like the fact that the thing is controversial and ultimately will be found to be untrue, because then they have the first story, vaccines cause autism, and then they get another paper a year or two later saying, no, it doesn't, and then maybe another one says, that, yes, it does, no, it doesn't. And you have the same kind of commercial pressures going along. So the idea that these are some sort of special sort of means of communication or source of truth is, to me, a myth, and a very disturbing myth when it percolates society in the way that it does. Just another magazine, and needs to be treated in the same way.
Mais alguma pergunta, algum comentário, Dr. Brian? Bom, não havendo mais, vamos encerrar a sessão. Queria agradecer mais uma vez a presença de todos. Lembrar que dia 13 terá esse evento lá na Invest São Paulo, perto na saída do portão 2 da cidade universitária, com a presença da doutora Lélia Guzmán, da OPAS, Programa de Imunização, o Brian vai falar, mais outros especialistas em 2 mesas da parte da tarde. Quem estiver interessado, por favor, entrar em contato com a gente. Mais uma vez, queria agradecer ao Brian thank you for your presentation. E encerrar a sessão. Infelizmente, a Cília me comunicou que o brunch que estava previsto, a empresa não atendeu o compromisso. Infelizmente, não teremos o brunch. E, então, até o próximo Café com Saúde. Obrigado, gente. Tchau, tchau.